Hi everyone, I'm Bakhtawar. I do book reviews and book casts, and today, in solidarity with World Mental Health Awareness Month, I think I missed week and day. I don't understand Instagram too well. On another note, follow me on Instagram. But anyway, so we're talking about The Bell Jar. The Bell Jar, that's what happens when you're a left-hander. That's my parrot. The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. This is, Sylvia Plath was a very famous poet. This is the only novel she wrote. And it was originally published under a pseudonym, but I think a month before she killed herself by gas inhalation, it was published under her own name. So as you can imagine, it is semi-autobiographical. It really speaks about her struggles with clinical depression and what was then not really categorized as bipolar disorder or mood disorder. So it's very revealing, it's very insightful, and I'm going to tell you why. So the story revolves around this young girl named Esther, who is kind of the scholarship whiz kid, and she wins this magazine contest, goes to the big city, goes to New York, and there she's supposed to be having the time of her life, as she says, but instead she plummets into a really serious type of depression and kind of dissociation. Don't mind that, that's my parrot. He's in every one of my videos, although for the wrong reasons. So understandably, when she goes to the big city, she feels more and more disconnected from people, and she tries to, because she has really poor self-image, and she's always had that, but it kind of worsens when she sees girls that are more fashionable than her, and for a time she really tries to emulate them, but it doesn't work. She calls herself numb as a dead trolley bus, and kind of indicates her lack of control by saying that I wasn't steering anything, not even myself. So this sort of ties in perfectly with the overarching metaphor of a bell jar, which, as you may know, is a scientific apparatus which is used either to put something on display or to create a sort of vacuum. And that's what she feels. She feels like she's been put on display, and also that it's a constrictive factor in her life, that she imagines the bell jar as having descended on her in order to control her or to just make her feel kind of numb and void and completely unrelated with the world. And in many ways she kind of embodies the qualities of the bell jar. She is not only affected by it, but is the bell jar herself, because she's trapped in her depression. And it makes me really think more about today, like some 50, 60, 65 years later, when we're sort of trapped by social media, and there's all this pressure, especially nowadays with this concept that's come out, toxic productivity, in which you're always being pushed to achieve and never really sort of taking a breath and trying to figure out what you want to do in life and what's really good for you. And here, especially in Asia, you're sort of given a mold outside of which it's said that you can't really succeed in life. And what if somebody just wants to live in a cabin and not talk to anyone? Why is that not acceptable? But I've seen an encouraging trend of kind of entrepreneurship and self-education and kind of wheedling away from the toxic culture of institutes and institutions and stuff. But as this high-achieving girl, Esther, clearly illustrates, if you don't feel like you're enough on the inside, nothing you achieve out there is going to matter. And she says things like, it should have been enough, but it wasn't. So Esther's mental health understandably worsens. She tries to kill herself by taking some 50 pills in the basement of her house, sort of underneath the floorboard, so to speak. And this is after all the treatments have failed, electroconvulsive therapy, which which actually, funnily enough, Sylvia Plath herself had considerable experience, because she underwent electroconvulsive therapy for years without any improvement, clearly. So in many ways the novel is also a nudge towards the failure of the healthcare system and kind of the failure of academic institutions, because the psychiatrists are often, they're malicious or they're kind of indifferent and they don't care what happens to anyone else. And during that time, during the 1940s and 50s, psychiatry was, well, quite significantly experimental, because they were doing all of these dangerous procedures, which I'll come to. So they didn't really care about what happened to the mental patient. As soon as you got that verdict, that diagnosis, you were pretty much done. And the novel is not just about the failure of these institutions, but it's also about the failure of the people, of the caretakers in Esther's life, the people who were supposed to love her, supposed to carry her over this current of depression, which eventually she sort of calls her life. She calls herself as having the eyes of a dead baby, simply looking upon the world as if it was a bad dream. I think that's the quote. I'll fix that up and write it as a caption. So she feels failed by all of these caretakers, the boy buddy that she's known forever, her mother who's always working, her father who died when she was 8. And this begs the larger question, how can you love yourself when all the people that were supposed to love you have failed? So there are also multiple references to lobotomies in the novel, which, as you may know, was an inhuman and is now an illegal psychiatric treatment in which they used to drill holes on either side of your brain and try to sever your nerve connection with the prefrontal cortex. Left thousands of, near normal people kind of cognitively challenged, and many of them never walked again. And by near normal, I mean people who just had depression or anxiety or, something like ADHD. It completely reduced them to a vegetable, which reminds me that was actually the ending of the 1962 novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I mean, who's seen Jack Nicholson's movie adaptation? That was brilliant. Because that's what happens to him in the end. They give him a lobotomy and he kind of becomes a vegetable. It was very sad. So, the bell jar, if you read it now, of course it's harrowing and everything. But many of the stuff you've heard of and you're familiar with in this age, but you have to really look at it in context, because back then, some 65 years ago, it was very unusual to talk about depression. And, psychiatry and psychology were both very under-researched. And historically, when I read about it, I was really astounded because, historically, the concept of mental illness and the diagnosis of mental illness has also been used to control people, especially women. Because, women back then, they had a lot to complain about. They couldn't vote. There were limited educational and, employment opportunities. I mean, there still are in the part of the world that I live in. But, so whenever they used to kind of be vocal about that or protest against that, and they would just give like a standard diagnosis of hysteria or mania, and then you could easily be lobotomized after that, And that's what happens with, the protagonist in what is possibly my favorite TV show of all time, Penny Dreadful. If you haven't seen it and you like sort of gothic literature and everything, I think you'll love it. Or psychology or supernatural fiction. I digress. So yeah, you were just one small step away from being lobotomized or institutionalized if you were just kind of manic, which, at any rate you would have a cause to be. And then you have the disaffectation which Esther suffers from. Disaffectation is kind of, I'll leave links below, it's kind of this psychological condition which is very difficult to diagnose, in which the individual pulverizes all trace of feeling and kind of they feel depressed, but they can't seem to connect to any understanding of people or life. They're just perpetually kind of trapped and confused and numb. And she calls this, Esther, the main character, she kind of calls this as the descending of the bell jar, And everyone seems subpar and phantom-like, and herself most of all. She says in the book, "The figures around me weren't people, but shop dummies, painted to resemble people and propped up in attitudes counterfeiting life." I thought that was beautiful. So that's all, folks. Bear in mind that I've only scratched the surface with this novel. There's a lot more in there. Pick it up, read it for yourself. And also, if you're suffering from depression or anxiety, know that you are not alone and that there's always people you can seek out for help, and that you should, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. And you can also reach out to me. If there's anything you feel that I can give advice on, you can sound off in the comments. Please take care of yourselves. Have a lovely day. Definitely give this a read. See you next time.